The year was 1881, and the wind that swept across the plains held no charity. It was a merciless thing, scouring the land and the small, defiant town of Providence until both were worn down to their essential, stubborn core. For Abigail Hale, the town and the wind were one and the same, a constant, abrasive presence that sought to strip away anything soft or gentle, leaving only what was hard enough to endure. Providence was built on piety and fence posts, a grid of rigid righteousness gouged into the vast, open canvas of the Dakota territories. The tallest structure was the church steeple, a sharp white needle that pricked the conscience of the sky and kept a vigilant, unforgiving watch over the souls huddled below. It was Reverend Blackwood's church, and by extension, Providence was his town. He preached of virtue and damnation, his words carving deep lines of judgment into the faces of his congregation, reinforcing the fear that bound them together, fear of God, fear of the devil, and most palpably, fear of the Lakota whose lands began just across the shallow, winding river. Abigail's life in this place was a borrowed one. Orphaned 5 years prior, she had been taken in by an aunt and uncle who saw her as a duty, another mouth to feed and soul to save. She was a silent figure in their cramped, joyless house, her existence measured in chores completed and prayers dutifully recited. She worked at the general store, her days a slow parade of weighing flour, measuring cloth, and enduring the veiled scrutiny of the townswomen. They saw her quietness as meekness, her sorrow as a shadow she ought to have shed by now. They did not see the fierce, desperate yearning that beat within her like a trapped bird. Her only solace was the river. In the stolen moments of twilight, she would walk its banks, the only place where the town's oppressive gaze seemed to falter. The rustle of the cottonwoods and the murmur of the water spoke a language older and truer than any sermon. It was a place of boundaries, the line between the world she knew and a world she was taught to fear. And it was there, in that liminal space, that she had found a life beyond Providence. It was there she had met Chayton. That memory was a secret fire she cupped in her hands now, a desperate warmth against the cold terror that was closing in. They were dragging her toward the town square, her arms pinned by the rough hands of Garrett Vance, a man whose piety was a thin veneer over a core of casual cruelty. Her aunt walked behind, her face a mask of shame. Her uncle was not present, he could not bear the disgrace. An abomination. Reverend Blackwood had thundered from his porch after Garrett had reported what he'd seen Abigail by the river, her hand held by a Lakota warrior. Not just any warrior. The chief's son. She has lain with the savage, polluted herself, and brought the stain of her sin upon this God-fearing community. There had been no trial, only a verdict delivered with the force of divine revelation. Now, the townspeople lined the dusty street, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous anger. They were the same people she had served coffee and salt to yesterday. Today, they looked upon her as if she were a serpent in their midst. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and defiance. The fear was for the pain to come, for the utter humiliation she was about to endure, but the defiance was for him, for Chaitan. In her mind, she fled the suffocating grip of the present and ran back to the river, back to the beginning. He had found her with her ankle caught in a tangle of roots, her basket of foraged berries spilled across the damp earth. She had been terrified, her mind flooded with the Reverend's warnings of brutal heathens. But he had not looked at her with malice. His eyes, dark and steady, had held a quiet concern. He had knelt, his movements fluid and unhurried, and worked her foot free with strong, gentle hands. He had spoken to her not in the grunts she had been led to expect, but in careful, measured English. "You are hurt?" he had asked. "No," she had whispered, pulling her foot back, her skin tingling where he had touched it. "Thank you." He had helped her gather the berries, his silence more comfortable than any conversation she had ever had in her uncle's parlor. He had introduced himself only as Chayton. She learned later who he was, the son of the great chief Tashunka. It should have frightened her more. It did not. Their meetings became her secret sacrament, She would tell her aunt she was seeking wildflowers. He would tell his people he was observing the patterns of the river. They talked for hours, their separate worlds bleeding into one another on that neutral shore. He taught her the Lakota names for the stars, weaving stories of the star beings into the night sky until it was no longer an empty void, but a vibrant tapestry of meaning. He showed her how to read the land, to see the passage of a deer in a broken twig, to know the coming of rain by the scent of the air. The world, which had always seemed a hostile place, began to feel like a living thing, a home. In return, she shared with him the only world she had, the one in her books. She told him of kings and oceans, of cities with buildings so tall they scraped the clouds. She spoke of her parents, of the sudden hollow silence their passing had left in her life. She confessed the profound loneliness that felt like a constant, low-grade fever. "Your people live close," he had observed one evening, watching the distant lights of Providence flicker to life. "But you are alone." "Sometimes being surrounded by people is the loneliest thing of all," she had replied, her voice thick. He had understood. He spoke of his own burden, the weight of being his father's son, the expectation of a future he had to earn, not just inherit. In those moments, he was not the fearsome savage of the Reverend's sermons, and she was not the pale, fragile settler. They were just two people finding in each other a reflection of their own hidden landscapes of hope and sorrow. Their connection was a fragile bridge built across a chasm of prejudice, a bridge built of whispered words and shared silences, a bridge that was now being burned. The hands holding her shoved her forward, and she stumbled, her bare feet stinging on the sharp gravel of the square. They had forced her to the foot of a crude wooden platform where a single stool stood waiting. The centerpiece of their theater of shame. Reverend Blackwood ascended the platform, his black coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a crow. He held his Bible aloft, a weapon against the sin he saw embodied in her slight frame. "Let this day be a lesson," his voice boomed, sharp and righteous. "Let the fate of this woman be a stark reminder of the wages of sin." She turned her back on her own kind, on decency, on God himself, to consort with the heathens who prowl at our borders. She opened the door to darkness, and we must now purify this house. Abigail raised her head, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She saw Mistress Donovan, who had wept in the store last week over the price of sugar, now staring at her with cold condemnation. She saw young Walter McBride, whose life she had saved with a poultice when he was bitten by a snake, now chanting Jezebel with his friends. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Garrett Vance pushed her onto the stool. His breath was sour, his grip bruising. "Hold still," he grunted, his eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction. "Time for your shearing, little lamb." He produced a pair of heavy sheep shears, the metal glinting dully in the harsh sunlight. A collective gasp, part horror and part thrill, rippled through the crowd. Abigail's hair was her one vanity, a thick, honey-brown cascade that fell to her waist. In her memories with Chayton, it was always loose, the wind catching in it as he tucked a stray strand behind her ear. He had once called it a river of sunlight. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to retreat to that memory, to the feel of his fingers, gentle and warm. But there was no escape. The cold, unyielding metal touched her neck. A sob, sharp and ragged, tore from her throat. The first cut was brutal. The shears were not sharp enough for hair, designed for tearing through coarse wool. They snagged and pulled, a violent rending sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence of the square. A thick hank of her hair fell to the dusty ground, then another and another. Garrett worked with a grim, focused energy, his knuckles brushing her scalp. Each pass of the shears was a desecration, a stripping away of her identity, of the woman Chayton had loved. She did not cry out again. A strange calm descended, the cold, clear peace that comes when the worst has finally happened. The pain was distant now. Her body was on the stool, but her spirit was far away, by the riverbank. She remembered his face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She remembered the promise he had made, his voice low and earnest as he held her hands. "I will not leave you in this place," he had said. "My path is your path now," a promise that felt like a bitter mockery in this moment. He was not here. He could not be here. If he came now, they would kill him. The shearing continued, a methodical destruction. With every lock of hair that fell, she felt lighter, not with relief, but with a terrifying emptiness. She was being unmade, erased. The sun beat down on her newly exposed scalp, hot and shaming. When Garrett was finished, he stepped back to admire his work. Her head was a ruin of ragged, uneven tufts, her scalp showing through, pale and vulnerable. A few women in the crowd tittered nervously. Others looked away, a flicker of pity finally breaking through their righteous facade. Reverend Blackwood raised his hands again. "Behold the mark of shame," he declared. "Let her be an outcast among us. Let no one offer her comfort or aid. Let her live with her sin, exposed for all to see, until she repents in the dust." They released her. She did not move from the stool, unable to summon the strength to stand. Her shorn hair lay around her feet like a dead thing. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, in the center of a circle of hate. She felt 1,000 miles from the river and 1,000,000 miles from Chayton. The hope she had nurtured, that fragile, secret flower, had been trampled into the dust. The days that followed were a blur of hollow survival. The town followed the Reverend's edict. Her aunt and uncle gave her a small bundle with a loaf of bread, a skin of water, and a threadbare blanket, and then barred the door of their house to her. The storekeeper refused to sell her provisions. Children threw stones at her when she tried to draw water from the public well. She took refuge in an abandoned line shack at the very edge of town, a place of crumbling sod and splintered wood, where the wind howled through the walls like a grieving thing. Her shorn head was a brand. She wore a thin scarf to cover it, but she could still feel the phantom weight of what was lost. More than the humiliation, it was the severing of her connection to him that wounded her most deeply. Her hair had been a part of their story, a tactile piece of the love they shared. Now it was gone. She was a ghost, haunting the fringes of a town that had disowned her. Her grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making each breath an effort. She spent her hours staring east, across the river, towards the lands where he lived, wondering if word of her shame had reached him. She hoped it had not. The thought of his pain was worse than her own. 1 week after the shearing, as the sun was bleeding its last crimson light across the horizon, she saw it, a plume of dust in the distance. At first, she thought it was a dust devil, a common trick of the eye on the plains. But it did not dissipate. It grew larger, resolving itself into a line of riders, many riders. Her heart seized. It was a war party, the Reverend's greatest fear, made manifest. They were coming for revenge. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her despair. This was her fault. Her sin, as the Reverend called it, had brought this upon Providence. Men would die. Women and children would suffer. She scrambled to her feet, her instinct to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The land was flat and open, offering no sanctuary. She could only stand beside her pathetic shack and watch them approach, a lone, desolate figure awaiting the apocalypse she had wrought. The town had seen them too. A bell began to clang frantically from the church steeple not the call to prayer, but the alarm. Doors slammed shut. Men with rifles appeared on rooftops, their silhouettes stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The air grew thick with a terrible, silent tension. The land itself held its breath. But as the riders drew closer, Abigail saw that something was wrong with her assumption. They were not riding hard. They moved with a slow, deliberate solemnity, a procession, not an attack. They carried lances, but they were decorated with feathers, not brandished for war. At their head rode 2 figures. One was Chief Tashunka, his magnificent war bonnet a cascade of eagle feathers that bespoke his great authority. And beside him, riding tall and straight, was Chayton. His eyes found her across the 100 yards of open ground that separated them. He did not look at the town, not at the men with rifles, not at the shuttered windows. He looked only at her. His face was a mask of unreadable emotion, but in the depths of his eyes she saw a fire that burned away her fear, replacing it with a wild, incredulous hope. The procession did not ride toward the center of town. They flowed around it, a silent, powerful river of men and horses, and came to a halt before her dilapidated shack. They formed a wide, silent crescent, hemming her in, yet it did not feel like a trap. It felt like a shield. The armed men of Providence watched from their perches, confused and unnerved. This was not the battle they had prepared for. Chief Tashunka remained on his horse, his gaze sweeping over the town with a look of profound, weary disdain. Chayton, however, dismounted. He handed his reins to another warrior and began to walk toward her. He moved with the same fluid grace she remembered from the riverbank, his moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. He carried no weapon. In his hands, he held something with the reverence of a sacred object. Abigail stood frozen, her heart a wild drum in her chest. The thin scarf she wore on her head suddenly felt like a coward's banner. With a trembling hand, she pulled it off, exposing the ragged ruin of her hair, the raw evidence of her shame. She would meet him without hiding. She would let him see what they had done to her. If he turned from her now, in disgust or pity, she would understand. He stopped a few feet from her. His eyes took in her shorn head, and a flicker of immense pain crossed his features, so deep it was as if he had been struck. But it was followed by a look of such fierce, unwavering tenderness that it made her knees weak. He saw the wound, but he saw her beyond it. From the town, a figure emerged, striding out from between the buildings with a self-important fury. It was Reverend Blackwood, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield. Garrett and a few other men trailed behind him, emboldened by his presence. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" the Reverend demanded, his voice straining to maintain its authority. "You are not welcome here, savage. Leave this place at once." Chayton did not even glance at him. His focus was entirely on Abigail. He took another step closer, his voice low and clear, meant only for her but carrying on the still evening air. "They took your hair," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "In my grandfather's time, this was done to a woman who was unfaithful to her husband. A mark of shame." Abigail flinched, the words striking her like stones. This was it, the confirmation of her disgrace, even in his eyes. But then he continued, his voice rising, imbued with a strength that pushed back against the encroaching twilight. "But to take it from a woman who has given her heart truly, who has shown courage in the face of hatred, that is not shame, that is a sacrilege." He looked past her then, his gaze finally sweeping over Reverend Blackwood and the men of Providence. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, hard and ancient. "You do not know what honor is," he said, his voice resonating with the authority of his father, of his entire lineage. "You mistake cruelty for justice and noise for strength. You tried to mark this woman with your shame. You have failed." He turned back to Abigail, and the hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by the profound love she had thought was lost to her forever. He raised the object he was holding. It was a headdress, but not a warrior's bonnet like his father's. It was smaller, more delicate, crafted from the finest, softest buckskin, and adorned with a single, perfect eagle feather that stood straight and proud at the back. More feathers, from the hawk and the falcon, cascaded down the sides. It was a thing of breathtaking beauty and immense significance. "The eagle feather is our highest honor," Chayton explained softly, his eyes locked on hers. "It is given for a great act of courage. It tells our people that the one who wears it has a spirit that cannot be broken, that they are cherished, that they belong to us." Reverend Blackwood sputtered, "This is blasphemy, covering one sin with another." Chayton ignored him completely. He took the final step, closing the space between them. With an infinite gentleness, he reached out and placed the headdress on her head. The soft buckskin settled over her scalp, a soothing balm on her raw skin. The feathers fell around her face and down her back, covering the pathetic, hacked remnants of her hair. It was not a covering of shame, but a coronation. He was not hiding what they had done, he was transforming it. He was taking the symbol of her lowest moment and crowning it with the symbol of his people's highest honor. Tears she had refused to shed in the square now welled in her eyes and streamed down her cheeks. They were not tears of pain or humiliation, but of a gratitude so immense it felt like it could split her heart open. He had not come with fire and vengeance, he had come with dignity, he had come with love, he had come to answer their ugliness with a beauty so profound it silenced them all. He did not kiss her or embrace her. The moment was too sacred for that. He simply rested his hand for a moment on the side of her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. In that touch, she felt everything: his grief for her suffering, his fury at her tormentors, and his absolute, unshakable commitment. He stepped back and spoke, his voice now a clear proclamation for all to hear the Lakota and the terrified people of Providence. Her name is Abigail Hale. She is not your outcast. She is my chosen wife. Her honor is my honor. Her people are my people. From this day forward, she walks my path. He turned and walked back to his horse with the same unhurried grace. Chief Tashunka gave a single, sharp nod, a silent affirmation of his son's words. The crescent of warriors shifted, opening a path. Chayton mounted his horse, then looked at Abigail, holding out his hand to her. It was her choice. To stay here, in the ruins of her old life, forever branded but now strangely defended, or to take his hand and step into a future she could not imagine. It was no choice at all. She walked toward him, her back straight, the feathers of her headdress swaying with each step. She felt the eyes of the entire town on her, but for the first time their judgment had no power. It could not touch her. She was shielded by an honor far older and stronger than their fear. She placed her hand in Chayton's, and he pulled her up to sit in front of him on his horse. As the Lakota procession turned to leave, Abigail looked back one last time at the town of Providence. She saw Reverend Blackwood standing impotent in the dust, his Bible hanging uselessly at his side. She saw Garrett Vance staring, his mouth agape, his act of cruelty rendered meaningless. She saw the faces in the windows, pale with shock and a dawning, terrible understanding that their world was smaller and weaker than they had ever believed. They had tried to shave her down to nothing, to erase her, but they had failed. Chaitan had not just saved her, he had given her a new name, a new crown, a new beginning. As they rode toward the river, toward the open lands of his people, she leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest. The wind that had once felt so cruel now felt like a promise, carrying the scent of sage and freedom. It lifted the eagle feather in her headdress, and for the first time in her life, Abigail Hale felt like she was truly going home.